If I were to tell you right now that the build you're watching on screen has more attributes invested in spellcasting ability than melee ability, would you believe me? How about now? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the wonderful attribute known as Arcane and the Dragon Communion Seal, we are capable of developing builds that revolve around spellcasting that don't have to sacrifice melee capability in the slightest. Yep, Arcane is king. I've been running Arcane since before patch 103, before they fixed the Arcane scaling with bleed, and it's always been a great stat. That's because I was running specifically Dragon Communion spells. Dragon Communion spells, obviously coming with the Dragon Communion Seal, which has excellent Arcane scaling, so Arcane was the stat that I went for. But since patch 1.03, Arcane was fixed so that it now properly scales bleed and poison as intended, and that makes it an excellent melee damage attribute as well if you run the bleed or the occult attributes on your, or the bleed or the occult affinities on your weapons. And this gives you an unparalleled level of freedom in your build and versatility with what you want to do. Now this build is based almost solely around incantations. And for the most part, you're going to want to run at least a few of the spells I've got listed here in my memory slots. Each of these spells are able to cover a weakness in your build. If you've got Unga Bunga, slow, heavy colossal weapon stuff, lightning spear, honed bolt, bestial claw, those are going to be your go-tos. If you're running a faster, more utilitarian build like I've got with my whips and fists, I get more use out of heavy hitting spells like Dragon Claw or Aspect of the Crucible Tail, the Rot Breath, hard hitting spells like that make up for my relatively low melee damage without the bleed. Those really kind of fill in those gaps for me, but I do use the utility of those lighter spells as well, those faster animations able to interrupt the casting of dedicated sorcerers and certain Ashes of War as well. It makes it a very, very good choice to keep on your roster. Anybody you see in PvP, if they're using incantations at all, they've probably got one of these incantations on their roster. Now, with that being said, these aren't the only incantations you can use. There is a huge roster of support and offensive incantations that are all great. I personally don't use buffs except for the physic every now and then, so I can't talk too much on that. But as far as the offensive incantations go, as of patch 1.04, they have all been buffed, they all cast faster, and they're all pretty darn cool and have a lot more viability now than they did before. There are a few of them that are still a little like Whirl O Flame can be good in certain circumstances, but it just isn't PvP viable. It maintains its PvE viability, especially against the tree sentinels and things like that. Anything weak to fire, that does great. But in general, your utility spells are going to be the most important, what you see on these memory slots up there. Alright, now, this build is very, very simple. I'm just going to lay out the foundation and you can modify it to your taste. But the main requirement is going to be Arcane and Faith. Now, Arcane, you're going to want to get it as high as you reasonably can. Faith, you're going to want to get it just enough to unlock whatever incantations you want to use. For the incantations that I listed, if you wanted to use all of those, you would need at least 27 Faith. If you want to use more powerful incantations, such as Placidusax's Ruin or Wrath of Gold, anything like that, Black Blade, you're going to want to get considerably more. However, for most use case scenarios, 28 Faith will get you everything you need. After that, you're going to want to bump your Arcane up at least past 30. Higher is recommended. After 30 Arcane, your bleed the bleed buildup starts to wane on the abilities. After 30 Arcane, the bleed buildup per Arcane attribute invested isn't as high. However, with this build, because you're using the Dragon Communion Seal to scale your incantation damage, Arcane is still relevant past 30. Once you get between 30 and 40 Arcane, you're going to want to go into whatever damage stat you like the most. In my case, that's Dexterity. The reason I like to use Dexterity is because it also boosts incantation cast speed, though not by a whole lot, because they're fast already. But it does boost the incantation cast speed, and I just don't like swords. I know that's weird, but I like whips, fists, and claws, so that's all I need is Dexterity. If you decide that you like Unga Bunga or anything like that, you're more than welcome to swap around to do that. You'll have a lot more melee viability than I do, but you will have to sacrifice the incantation cast speed, but again, it's not a huge difference. You'll still have the same amount of damage output in your incantation power, and you'll have a larger variety of weapons to use as well. I cannot use most weapons with my build because at 10 strength, that locks me out of about 70% or so of all melee weapons. Vigor is going to be low. You can sacrifice some mind, some endurance, and bump up your Vigor if you really want to. I have found that even at level 200, 45 Vigor is enough to compete in PvP, and it's definitely more than enough in PvE once you start getting plenty of flasks. I didn't get past 45 Vigor until I was well past level 150, and I had no real issues as far as survivability in PvP or PvE. It was just enough for me to handle a couple of hits from the really big specialists that focused into major spellcasting power, colossal sword, heavy hitters that use buffs, things like that. It was enough for me to compete. So, for my experience, 45 Vigor is as much as you'll ever need, realistically. Even though the meta is 60. 60 is the soft cap for Vigor, and that's what everyone says you should stick at. I just don't see the need for it with this build. You're able to control the field in such a reliable way with the different incantations and the way you can weave in and out from melee to long range, back and forth, and maintain the same level of efficacy. It allows you to kind of sacrifice that tankiness because you just don't need to trade that much. It's not really a trading build. It's not made for that. It's made for controlling rather than trading. If you wanted to, however, you can absolutely up your Vigor and sacrifice for some mind and endurance. I wouldn't drop your endurance too low because poise is important. Ironically enough, the high poise is important because you don't have enough Vigor to reliably take multiple hits without being able to trade. So if you are going to get hit, it needs to matter. In that case, having high poise, mine says 74, but I'm using the Bull Goat Talisman, so it's actually 99 poise. At 99 poise, if I do get hit from a jumping attack or a rolling R1 Colossal Weapon poke, anything like that, I'm still able to trade and hit them with an L1 combo, and make that hit matter. So that's why I suggest having your endurance high enough to at least get 75 poise on your build. That'll really balance things out for you. I like having as much mind and endurance as I can because incantations are FP and stamina draining. So you can't, whenever you're combining melee and spellcasting, the big downside is going to be you're going to be very bursty and not very sustainable. And what I mean by that is your FP can last a pretty long time. Like at over 200 FP, you're able to keep your FP up for a pretty good while. But your stamina at 132, even if I were to pump way more points into stamina, my stamina is still going to drain pretty quickly. I cannot keep constantly casting. I can get 4 or 5 good spells out, 2 or 3 hits, and then I've got to recharge my stamina. So I would make endurance your priority stat and mind your secondary stat, unless you really want to beef into to spell casting. And this right here is why this build is so potent. It's because the Dragon Communion Seal has an S rank arcane scaling at +9 and 10, and it's got a B rank faith scaling, so that those minimum points you put into faith to unlock those incantations, those points will still contribute pretty fairly into the damage of those incantations as well, but arcane is where this build really shines. Now, with arcane scaling, depending on your weapon, if your weapon by default has arcane scaling on it already and it's got a passive bleed effect, bleed is going to go up. If it's got a passive bleed effect with no arcane scaling, bleed will not increase unless you give it arcane scaling. So for weapons that are capable of attaching affinities via the Ashes of War, you're able to boost their bleed buildup by quite a lot. My whips, for example, each have 110 bleed buildup. The fists, I believe, have 108, and that's with the blood affinity. If I use the occult affinity, they'll have slightly less bleed buildup, but they'll have considerably higher melee damage, and the reason for that is because the occult status, or the occult affinity, increases the amount of arcane scaling on the weapon, which passively increases the bleed buildup. And because I'm not purely into arcane, that bleed buildup isn't as high as it would be if I just use the pure bleed affinity. However, that extra arcane scaling does boost my main damage. So depending on the weapon you're using, it may be better to go with one or the other. So now here are a few examples of how this sort of gameplay can mixing in these spells along with your melee can really throw off enemies and give you a better sense of control over the combat. Now, as you can see, he's got me beat in pure melee damage. Without proccing bleed, I can't compete. I can't trade with him. However, my incantations hit like a fucking truck, and they've got better range than his swords. So when I realize, hey, you know, I can't beat him in melee, I switch to the spellcasting and take control of the battle. Here's another example of a very similar circumstance where this guy can two-shot me with jumping L1s. With his jumping combo attack, he can straight up murder me. However, I've got a range advantage on him with the incantations and the whips, so if I try not to trade with him and I'm careful about how I play defensively, popping him here and there, I can whittle him down over time before he's got a chance to really do anything. Now, you know this has to be frustrating for him. He just threw all those spells at me, and then just one of my incantations darn near killed him, inflicted him with rot, and now he's got to whittle down a good 70% of my health if he wants to take this match back. It ain't gonna happen. can use spells like that to create space to allow you to cast the more powerful spells like this. Then you can chain into more precise spells, such as Hone Bolt or Lightning Spear. This level of combinations between short and long range spells, AoE, it throws enemies off and they don't really know what to expect from you, so they'll be a little bit more wary. Being able to cast spells such as this and take melee AoE into account as well can also really help you out a lot. That's why I highly recommend this roster of spells, both for PvE and PvP. They are a lot of fun. If you decide you want to build more into Faith, I know there are some weapons that scale with Faith, so a pure Faith Arcane build is very viable as well. You'll have access to more powerful incantations that'll make this build that much better. All of my favorite incantations, aside from Dragonclaw, they all take 36 or more Faith, and if you like Faith, if you like the Faith weapons and the aesthetic on the Faith incantations, that's a great way to go too. Now, as far as weapons and Ashes of War to use with this build, that's going to depend entirely on you. This build is more a foundation for people that want this type of playstyle, rather than, this isn't one of those, oh, Rivers of Blood is up, use this exact build exactly this way type of things. This is more a general foundation for you to build upon and change as you see fit. If you like a certain type of weapon, that whatever that weapon is, so long as you can get it to scale with the necessary attributes, then it'll work well with this build. I like whips, claws, and fists because the claws and fists are cool. That's the only reason I use them over anything else, is just because I think they're neat and they're unique and I don't see them a lot. That's pretty much the whole reason for that. I use evasive skills such as Raptor of the Mists more than I use offensive skills, because I find that it's more valuable to avoid taking damage than it is to have another of umpteen ways to deal damage. Like there are hundreds of ways to deal damage in this game and very few ways to avoid damage. So I find those skills more valuable. There are alternative options to Bloodhound Step. If you're playing PvP, especially at 125, and you use Bloodhound Step, there are going to be some salty tears, so consider using alternative methods if you like the evasive playstyle. Raptor of the Mists, Quick Step, AoE is another way to avoid things like that, can really help out. But I hope this video helped. I hope it was informative. I'm not used to making guides with quite this level of depth, so if you've got any feedback or questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching.